Ilara's existence was a thin, worn thread stretched across the monotonous loom of the dusty Blackwood ranch, her very soul a brittle thing, corroded by the bitter tang of betrayal and the profound shame of having been a transaction, a piece of property sold to the gruff, unfeeling old man. Each day unfolded with the quiet, suffocating predictability of a slow death, marked only by the shifting patterns of dust motes dancing in the meager shafts of light that pierced the grimy panes of the bunkhouse, and the pervasive scent of dry hay mingling with the haunting, indelible memory of her father's once loved, now despised face, a constant dull ache behind her ribs. The relentless Old West sun, a cruel, indifferent eye in the vast, pale sky, rose daily to press down upon her chest like an invisible boulder, a crushing confirmation of her unseen prison, where her only true companions were the incessant dry whispers of the wind, rustling through the wooden slats of the dilapidated shed, carrying only empty promises of a freedom that felt eternally out of reach, a cruel, mocking song against the backdrop of her silent despair. On a particularly stifling afternoon, as the distant, mournful lowing of the cattle drifted across the parched plains, and the western sky began to bleed into a canvas of smouldering orange and deep violet, the lean, unmistakable silhouette of a rider materialized on the distant horizon, a stark, moving line against the vibrant sunset. This was no familiar ranch hand, Ilara instantly discerned. The precise, almost predatory way he held himself in the saddle, the economical grace of his movement, betrayed a sharp, focused purpose that sent an immediate, cold jolt through her weary heart, a flicker of primal hope, long dormant beneath layers of fear and ingrained distrust, briefly igniting within her a tiny, defiant spark against the overwhelming dread that had become her constant companion. The young man, his eyes like chips of flint and his hands calloused from hard living, dismounted with an unhurried, deliberate composure, the air around him thick with the pungent smells of worn leather, stale sweat, and the sharp, metallic tang of recently discharged gunpowder. He met her gaze with an unnerving intensity, and then his grave voice, cutting through the vast, breathing silence of the twilight, echoed like a sudden, unexpected gunshot. "Your father didn't sell you for gold, miss. He sold you to settle a blood debt." The very earth seemed to hold its breath in that suspended moment, the dry wind abruptly ceasing its mournful whistle, and a profound, icy shiver snaked its way down Ilara's spine. This revealed truth, stark and brutal, was not a pathway to freedom, but an unwelcome invitation to an even deeper abyss, a monstrous secret that she and this enigmatic gunslinger, with his opaque intentions, would now share beneath the vast, indifferent gaze of the implacable Old West. The world, for a heart-stopping beat, became a dizzying blur of muted colors and muffled sounds, as if a sudden invisible hand had clapped over her ears, silencing the distant low of cattle and the gentle sigh of the wind through the parched grass. Ilara felt the ground beneath her shift, not physically, but as if the very bedrock of her understanding had fractured, revealing an abyss far more terrifying than the one she had merely glimpsed before. The betrayal she had nursed, a bitter, familiar taste on her tongue, morphed into a cold, visceral terror, for a debt of blood spoke of violence, of unforgiving scores, and a world where even a father's love could be twisted into a weapon. Her gaze, wide and unblinking, fixed on the stranger, searching his flinty eyes for an answer, a hint of the monstrous truth that had now been laid bare. The raw, aching shame of her father's act now mingling with a desperate, chilling fear for what this new reality portended. The last golden tendrils of sunlight stretched across the dusty yard, painting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe with unspoken menace, each fleeting moment drawing her deeper into an unknown, dangerous current. The gunslinger, his posture unwavering, offered no immediate comfort, only the stark, unsettling stillness that precedes a storm, his presence an immovable monument against the vast, darkening sky. He watched her, a silent, almost predatory assessment in his gaze, as if measuring the depth of her shock, gauging her capacity to absorb the grim truth he had so casually delivered. A shiver, colder than the deepening twilight, traced a path up Ilara's spine, not merely from the evening chill, but from the profound sense of being utterly exposed. Her life, her very existence, now redefined by this stranger's words, intertwined with a history she knew nothing of. The faint, earthy smell of dying embers from a distant cook fire mingled with the dry, familiar scent of dust and a faint, acrid whiff of the stranger's lingering gunpowder, grounding her to the present moment, even as her mind reeled, frantically sifting through fractured memories, desperate for any flicker of understanding. She realized with a chilling certainty that this was not a simple transaction, but a covenant forged in shadow, a legacy of violence that had finally mercilessly come for her. Ilara's breath caught, a strangled gasp that vanished unheard in the vast, indifferent quiet of the ranch, the familiar dust, usually a comforting blanket of monotony, now feeling like a suffocating shroud. Her mind, a whirlwind of shattered fragments, replayed the chilling pronouncement, blood debt, tasting of ash, though no fire burned nearby, leaving a bitter dryness on her tongue. The distant, rhythmic creak of the windmill, once a soothing lullaby, transformed into a relentless metallic tick-tock, each revolution counting down an unknown fate she couldn't yet comprehend. She lifted her gaze to the gunslinger, her eyes pleading for a shred of explanation. In his impassive face but found only cold, unyielding stone, the deepening shadows of twilight, carving his hawkish features into a mask of grim resolve as the last light bled from the western sky, painting the horizon in ominous hues of bruised purple and crimson. The monumental weight of this revelation pressed down upon her, more crushing than any physical chains, systematically obliterating the last vestiges of her already fragile spirit. The gunslinger, with a deliberate, almost theatrical slowness, finally stirred, a subtle shift of his broad shoulder that caused the worn leather of his coat to creak, a dry, unnerving sound in the twilight. From an inner pocket, he produced a tightly rolled parchment, its edges slightly frayed, and his voice, still low, now carried a new chilling finality that made the fine hairs on Ilara's arms prickle with premonition. "The debt isn't just to old Blackwood," he stated, his words cutting through the stillness. "It's to a family with long memories and a strong belief in settling scores, a justice that extends beyond mere coin." As he unfolded the brittle document, the soft rustle of the paper echoed like a distant, inevitable threat, each crease a shadow on her dawning understanding. Ilara's gaze darted frantically from his grim countenance to the unfamiliar script on the document, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, the terrifying implications beginning to coalesce. She wasn't merely a possession, but collateral, helpless pawn in a brutal game, far more dangerous and deadly than any she could have imagined. Inextricably tethered to a legacy of violence she was utterly unprepared to inherit. Ilara's gaze, previously fixed on the unfolding parchment, now lifted to the gunslinger's hardened face, searching for any flicker of mercy or misdirection in his cold, unwavering eyes, but found only the stark, unyielding truth reflected in their depths. The unfamiliar script of the document, an arcane scrawl of names and dates, conveyed an ancient, weighty history that she could not read but instantly felt, a chill that seeped into her bones far deeper than the encroaching evening air. A profound, nauseating dread bloomed in her stomach, eclipsing the familiar bitterness of her previous confinement, replacing it with a terror born of the unknown and the inescapable reach of a vengeful legacy. The distant lowing of cattle, usually a monotonous backdrop to her despair, now sounded like a mournful wail, and the wind, previously a whisper of empty promises, now carried the biting edge of imminent peril, rustling through the dry sagebrush with an almost predatory hiss. She felt the world tilt on its axis, her small, dusty existence suddenly swallowed by a chasm of ruthless vendetta, a horrifying revelation that transformed her from a forgotten commodity into a living sacrifice. The very ground beneath her feet seemed to vibrate with the silent weight of a generational curse she was now destined to bear. He merely nodded, a curt, almost imperceptible gesture, as if confirming her unvoiced understanding of her newfound, dreadful predicament, then slowly refolded the parchment, tucking it away with the same methodical precision he might use to holster a pistol. "Your father, he drew blood," the stranger stated, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate in the twilight air. "And the family, they demand theirs in return. You are the balance, the assurance that the score will be settled, one way or another." His words, devoid of emotion, carried a chilling weight, a cold, hard finality that extinguished any lingering ember of hope within Ilara's breast. The last vestiges of the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaky, violent hues of orange and purple, a reflection of the turmoil now consuming her fragile world. A shiver, not entirely from the cooling air, ran down her spine as the full implication of his statement settled. She wasn't just a pawn, but a sacrificial lamb, marked and bound to a fate intertwined with a brutal, ancient cycle of vengeance that stretched far beyond the dusty confines of Blackwood's ranch. A chilling realization that solidified her terror into a cold, unwavering resolve. A gasp, cold and ragged, clawed its way up Ilara's throat, catching in the parched air as the full, venomous weight of the stranger's words settled over her like a shroud woven from ice and shadow. The dusty ground beneath her worn boots seemed to tilt precariously, threatening to swallow her whole into an abyss far deeper than any she had ever imagined within the monotonous confines of Blackwood's ranch. Her previous life, a prison of silent servitude, now appeared a deceptive sanctuary, its invisible bars only just made visible by the chilling truth. Her father's face, once a source of complicated grief and a lingering, faint love, contorted into a mask of pure, unforgivable betrayal in her mind's eye, his memory now a fresh wound, festering with the poison of his ultimate deceit. To have been a mere commodity, exchanged for meager gold, was a bitter pill she had learned to swallow, but to be a living payment for a debt of blood, to be marked as a sacrificial lamb in a ledger of vengeance, that was a poison that seeped into her very bones, chilling her to the marrow and robbing her of breath, leaving her limbs heavy, useless, utterly abandoned. The vast, indifferent sky, still bleeding streaks of violent crimson and bruised purple from the vanished sun, pressed down on her like an oppressive lid, trapping her within this horrifying new reality, a truth delivered by a stranger whose cold, unblinking gaze held no pity, only a grim, unwavering resolve that promised a relentless pursuit of the bloody score, while a distant coyote's mournful howl seemed to mock the fragile silence stretched taut with her unspoken dread. The gunslinger remained as still as a stone monument, his silhouette a sharp, dark cutout against the deepening twilight, his posture unwavering as he observed the crushing impact of his revelation settle upon her. He offered no word of comfort, no gesture of reassurance, nor did he press for a response, simply watched, a predator assessing the full extent of its prey's understanding, allowing the horror to fully bloom within her, to take root and spread its tendrils through her very soul. The air grew perceptibly colder, carrying with it the scent of dry earth mingled with the lingering metallic tang of his recently fired gun, a scent that now seemed to cling to the very air she breathed, a grim, constant reminder of the inherent violence in his message and the brutal implications of her new role. Ilara, her hands clasped so tightly at her waist that her knuckles were stark white points against her skin, found her voice caught somewhere between her chest and her throat, a strangled sound of protest and disbelief that refused to articulate itself, leaving her stranded in a terrifying, isolating silence. The immense, sprawling vastness of the prairie, stretching endlessly under the emerging, indifferent stars, suddenly felt less like a wild landscape and more like a desolate stage for an unfolding tragedy, a solitary, desperate drama witnessed only by the distant, unblinking eyes of the heavens and the chilling, calculating gaze of the man who had brought such utter ruin to her dusty doorstep. He took a slow, deliberate breath, the subtle rise and fall of his chest the only sign of life in the statuesque figure, a silent testament to the profound patience of a man used to waiting for the final, inevitable reckoning. A cold dread, stark and immediate, clawed at Ilara's throat, constricting her breath until the air itself seemed to grow thin and sharp, tasting of grit and despair. A far cry from the usual dusty sweetness of the evening breeze. The revelation that her father had sold her not for coin, but to settle a grim ledger etched in blood, ripped through the fragile fabric of her world, shattering the last vestiges of a past she had clung to, a past where even her captivity, however bitter, possessed a certain, if twisted, logic. The betrayal now felt infinitely more profound, a betrayal not just of her freedom, but of her very identity, turning the love she once harbored for her parent into a festering wound, a gnawing cavity in her chest where warmth had once resided, leaving behind only the hollow echo of a truth too brutal to bear. The muted, distant lowing of the cattle, usually a comforting thrum against the vast silence, now seemed to mock her, a mournful dirge for a life irrevocably lost, as the sun dipped further, casting long skeletal shadows that danced across the parched earth, mirroring the grim spectres of her future. Her gaze, unfocused and wide with a dawning, terrifying clarity, drifted across the endless expanse of the land, finding no solace in its indifferent beauty, only an amplified sense of her own, crushing insignificance. The stranger, a silhouette etched against the dying light, remained unmoving, his posture one of patient, dangerous vigilance, his eyes, dark and unreadable, fixed on Ilara's face, meticulously cataloguing the rapid descent of her composure, the tremor that now shook her slight frame, a testament to the raw, visceral impact of his words. He offered no comfort, no softening of the brutal truth, his silence an unspoken decree of her new, horrifying reality. A subtle shift of weight, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw, was the only indication of the urgency that simmered beneath his composed exterior, an urgency born of a mission that transcended her personal anguish, a greater, darker purpose that had no room for her sorrow. The faint metallic scent of the gun he wore at his hip seemed to grow stronger, a palpable presence in the cooling air, an unspoken promise of violence, a reminder that her fate was now inextricably bound to the unforgiving codes of a world far removed from the quiet desolation of Blackwood's ranch, a world where debts were paid in lives, and hers, it seemed, was the coin. He simply waited, an immovable object in the shifting sands of her shattered existence, the unspoken question hanging heavy between them. What now? The very ground beneath Ilara's worn boots seemed to buckle and twist, not a physical tremor, but a profound, sickening lurch within her own soul, as if the foundations of her entire miserable existence had been violently ripped away, leaving her suspended over an abyss far deeper and more terrifying than the one she had merely imagined. The words, "Divida de sangue," echoed in the vast, empty canyons of her mind, a guttural final pronouncement that stripped away the last vestiges of a father she had already scorned, revealing a man capable of a betrayal so absolute, so chillingly devoid of humanity, that it eclipsed even the ignominy of being sold for mere gold. A bitter, metallic taste flooded her mouth, a phantom taste of the blood that now bound her, a chill seeping into her bones that transcended the cooling evening air, leaving her hollowed out, utterly vulnerable, a pawn in a game whose rules she was only now beginning to grasp, a game played with lives, not just livelihoods, under the indifferent gaze of an unforgiving sun. The distant lowing of cattle, once a monotonous comfort, now sounded like a lament, a dirge for the girl she once was, for the shattered innocence she could never reclaim, swallowed whole by the monstrous shadow of a debt she had no part in incurring, yet was now bound to repay. The gunslinger remained a stark, unwavering silhouette against the deepening ochre of the horizon, his patience a testament to a quiet, deadly resolve that unnerved Ilara more than any overt threat. His gaze, unblinking and devoid of pity, seemed to bore into her very core, demanding an acknowledgement of the terrible truth he had laid bare, a silent, unyielding pressure that pressed down on her lungs, making each breath a conscious, painful effort. She could feel the faint tremor in her hands, a helpless automatic response to the sheer, unassailable finality of her situation, the realization slowly solidifying within her that there was no escape, no bargaining, no appeal against the cold, implacable logic of a blood debt in this merciless land. The scent of dust and distant sage, mingled with the faint, sharp tang of gunpowder that clung to him, filled her nostrils, a grim perfume of her new reality, a world where the quiet despair of Blackwood's ranch had been exchanged for a more immediate, more visceral danger, one that promised not a slow, agonizing death of the spirit, but a swift, brutal end to everything she had ever known, and perhaps to her very life. A cold, unyielding tremor began deep within Ilara's bones, slowly spreading outward, until her entire frame felt as if it were vibrating with a muted, desperate energy, a response to the raw, visceral terror that now clawed at the edges of her consciousness. The simple indignity of having been sold for coin, a shame that had festered within her for so long, now seemed a paltry, almost comforting lie compared to the monstrous truth that her father had bartered her very life to settle a debt steeped in blood. A revelation that not only stripped away her last vestiges of hope, but also redefined the very essence of her existence, twisting it into something altogether more sinister and inescapable. The dusty ground beneath her feet, once merely the floor of her isolated world, now felt like an abyss opening to swallow her whole. The familiar scent of dry earth and sun-baked timber replaced by an imagined tang of rust and ancient violence, a premonition of the grim future that stretched before her, unending and shadowed by the silent, implacable figure of the man who stood as the stark, unblinking messenger of her new, horrifying reality. Her breath hitched in her throat, a small, ragged sound lost in the vast quiet of the plains, as the weight of this unspeakable truth pressed down upon her, threatening to crush her spirit beneath its monumental, unforgiving burden. The gunslinger, observing her unraveling without a flicker of overt emotion, merely shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, his gaze remaining fixed, unwavering. A silent, unyielding pressure that felt more potent than any spoken threat, an understanding passing between them that transcended mere words. He allowed the raw truth to settle, to calcify within her, knowing that resistance in this barren and unforgiving world was often a luxury afforded only to the dead, and her path, whatever it might become, was already set. The last rays of the setting sun bled across the horizon, painting the distant mesquite in hues of deep crimson and bruised purple, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched across the yard, enveloping Ilara in their deepening gloom, as if to emphasize the inescapable nature of her fate, mirroring the profound and permanent alteration of her world. The air grew cooler, carrying with it the faint, mournful cry of a distant coyote, a sound that seemed to echo the desolate emptiness that now bloomed in her heart, a chilling harbinger of the solitary and perilous journey that lay ahead, a life now irrevocably bound by a debt she had not incurred, but was now utterly beholden to repay. Ilara's body felt like an empty husk, hollowed out by the sudden, brutal wind of truth that had ripped through her carefully constructed ignorance. The dust on her tongue, once merely an inconvenience of ranch life, now tasted like grit and betrayal, mingling with the metallic tang of fear that coated the back of her throat, a sickening reminder of the words that had just sealed her fate. Her breath caught somewhere in her chest, a painful knot of disbelief and a nascent rage that throbbed behind her eyes, threatening to burst forth in a torrent of useless tears or futile screams that would only shatter the fragile peace of the encroaching night. Every fiber of her being screamed against the injustice, against the casual cruelty of her father's choice, a choice that had made her a chattel not for coin, but for something far more sinister and binding. The scent of drying hay, usually a comfort, now seemed cloying, trapping her in this dusty tableau of her undoing. She could feel the uneven thumping of her heart against her ribs, a frantic sparrow, trapped in a cage, desperately seeking an escape that simply did not exist within the vast, indifferent landscape that stretched out around them. The vastness of the sky above, now a deep indigo streaked with the last vestiges of twilight orange, seemed to mock her smallness, her utter powerlessness against the crushing weight of a legacy she had neither asked for nor understood, but which now claimed her entirely. The gunslinger, a silhouette of grim resolve against the fading light, remained. Still, his patience an unnerving counterpoint to the storm raging within her, his very presence a quiet, unyielding challenge for her to acknowledge the bleak reality now laid bare. He did not move, did not speak another word, but the subtle shift of the leather straps on his gun belt, the faint whisper of the wind teasing the brim of his hat, were enough to convey the inexorable momentum of the situation, a silent promise that this pause was merely a breath before the next, more demanding, phase. The world had shrunk to this dusty yard, to the space between her shattered self and his impenetrable demeanor, the distant lowing of cattle, and the ever-present creak of the windmill now fading into an indistinct backdrop to her personal apocalypse. A single brazen fly buzzed irritatingly close to her ear, a tiny, insistent sound that grated against the raw nerves of her overwrought mind, a cruel reminder of the mundane continuity of life even as her own existence had been irrevocably cleaved in two. He watched her, not with pity but with a cold assessing clarity, as if she were a wild horse to be broken, or perhaps a ledger entry waiting to be balanced, the heavy, unspoken question hanging in the thickening air. What would she do now, stripped of her illusions and standing at the precipice of an unknown, dangerous future, a future intrinsically tied to a debt of blood she had unknowingly inherited? The raw, brutal truth of a blood debt, not gold, vibrated through Ilara's bones, shaking her to the core in a way even Blackwood's grim possession never had. It wasn't merely ownership, but an inherited curse, twisting her past into a grotesque lie. The air grew heavy with the weight of her father's betrayal, a phantom hand around her throat, suffocating the last vestiges of the naive girl she'd been moments ago, replaced by a bitter, hollow ache that settled deep in her chest. She could taste the metallic tang of dust on her tongue, feel the rough, splintered wood of the corral fence pressing into her palms as she unconsciously gripped it, her knuckles white. The distant chirping of crickets began to pierce the oppressive silence, a relentless, tiny chorus that mocked the monumental shift within her, while the gunslinger remained a stone sentinel, his gaze unyielding, a silent, implacable force demanding a response that Ilara hadn't yet formulated, her mind a tangled knot of rage, grief, and a dawning, terrible understanding that her options were as vast and empty as the darkening plains around them. This revelation, a wound far deeper than any whip, had stripped her of the illusion of victimhood, revealing her as a pawn in a game far older and bloodier than she could have ever imagined, a game from which there was no retreat. A sudden, fierce surge of something resembling defiance, tempered by a pragmatism born of hardship, ignited within Ilara's chest, a tiny ember in the desolate landscape of her heart. She would not remain a passive sacrifice. Her chin lifted infinitesimally. Her gaze, though still shadowed by shock, met his with a nascent, steely resolve that surprised even herself, a silent declaration that while her father had chosen her fate, she would now choose her response. The gunslinger, who had seen much of the world's brokenness etched into faces, seemed to register the subtle shift, a flicker of something unreadable passing across his own cold features before he simply nodded once, a curt, almost imperceptible movement that spoke volumes of his understanding. Without another word, he turned, retrieved his horse, and with a soft jingle of bit and bridle, mounted the animal, gesturing with a tilt of his head towards the shimmering, uncertain horizon where the last vestiges of sunset bled into the encroaching night. A silent invitation, or perhaps a command, to follow him into the unknown, leaving the dust and despair of Blackwood's ranch behind, her new, dangerous journey beginning under the first cold stare of the emerging stars.